Cool. So, File New is a great place to start. We are going to do a custom thing, and I'm going to call it digital data. You guys call it whatever you want. It's just going to be a trash file at the end of the day. Unless, of course, you create something you do want to keep. So, I'm going to design this for the larger size paper, which is 11 by 18, and I'm going to make it a portrait mode. So, I'm going to do 11 by 18. I think it's a really good idea when you're doing anything that you ever might print and frame to do 300 resolution. Again, my standards are 72 for screen, 150 for like a low res print job. Text is fine at 150. Something you're going to put on the coffee shop, pinned to the post board. 150 is just fine. 300 is really where you should be for anything you're going to frame. And that number can drift between 240 or 360 is probably the highest I've seen people work. So 11 by 18 at 300 pixels per inch. Do we have any questions at this point in the semester about what pixels per inch are or resolution is? Cool. Great. We want to change this 8-bit to 16-bit. And we're going to just leave that white. I'm probably going to be deleting that. But our paper is white, so we may want to keep it. Then I'm going to hit create. Wonderful. So we have a background layer. Again, we're working through a layer stack in Photoshop. I'm going to just go onto Google and find a picture. I'm going to Google turtles. I'm going to go to Google Images. And I'm going to pick out an image that looks like it's all in focus and has edges that I can cut out pretty easily. This guy here looks pretty great. I'm going to note this number here in the bottom left. This is your how many pixels that image is. If we go back to Photoshop and go to Image, Image Size, we can see the size of our document that we're working in. Right now we're measured in inches. If we change that to pixels, we can see that this document is 3,300 pixels across by 5,400 pixels tall. And at 300 pixels per inch, that makes an 11 by 18 piece of paper. If we change that to 72, the resolution here, and then change it to pixels, we can see that we now have far fewer pixels than we did before because there are fewer than 1/3 of the pixels left on the screen. Make sense? So I'm going to change this back to 300. First I'm going to go back to inches just so that doesn't change. I'm going to go back to 300 pixels per inch. Cool. Okay. Now back to here. So this is maybe going to fill half of this. It was 5400 by 3300, and we can see that this is 2000 by 1500. So this is not going to fill my entire screen. It used to be that you had to click and actually go to view the image for it to come into Photoshop as a full resolution. Otherwise, even if it was a 10 billion megapixel picture, when you drag and drop, you're dragging and dropping the thumbnail of the image rather than the actual image. So I have it as habit. Normally when you click, you'll see a view image here. Am I in Yahoo or something? No, they seem to have changed their setup a bit. But I believe that about a year ago, Google fixed that. Might be 10 years for all I know. So now I believe you can just drag and drop this and it won't take the thumbnail. But if ever you see in another search engine or something that the image should be a very high number of pixels and you drag it into Photoshop and it looks very small, then make an extra effort, go to the actual picture. It should say like .jpeg at the top or .png at the top. So anyway, I'm just going to drag. Oh, I grabbed the wrong picture. There we go. Dragging this guy, just dropping it right into Photoshop. There we go. That is quite small. But the 2000, yeah, and 1500. So that makes. I just went here and dragged and dropped it. If that doesn't work for you, I'm going to choose another photo and demonstrate another way to do it. This guy. This guy looks great. Gosh, I love turtles. So this one's a bit bigger than the last image. Even though it looks smaller on my screen, it says it's bigger. So I'm going to save it here. Save. Oh, nope, that's just bookmarking it. All right, I'm right-clicking, viewing the image. That looks crazy small. I think this is some sort of weird coding thing that's happening. So I
Copy paste it?
You should be able to. Let's try that. Copy image, go over here, edit, paste. Yep. And sure enough, even though this says it's a giant image, I'm only looking at a thumbnail and it came out super tiny. So sometimes you just got to do a bit of extra hunting. So I'm going to click on that and see if I can't find the original. Turns out that it was a filthy lie. So maybe click some of these others. Yeah. That's a bit better. Still not as big as the last one, but so save image as, downloads. Cool. So some of this is kind of a repeat of the other class that I'm teaching. So I may ask a few times if we've covered anything before. Have we talked about smart objects in this class? No. Wonderful, wonderful. So everybody now download rather than copy and paste one. So I right-clicked it and I saved image as, and I put it in my downloads folder. So instead of taking it straight into Photoshop, we've dumped it into our downloads folder. I'm going to go to my downloads here. Going to look at this JPEG. Boop. Cool. And then I'm going to drag and drop from my downloads folder in. Wonderful. This did something different. Instead of just putting it there, it's kind of sized it to my document, and now I can't click anywhere that isn't in that photo. It's just showing me that photo. And I can see up here that it's being placed, is how they call it. It's being placed into my Photoshop file at 41% of its original scale, which is much smaller than I expected it to be. What you need to do to regain control of your computer is to hit enter. And then that places the file. So if you ever drag, I'm going to do that one more time for everybody. So I'm going to downloads, I'm dragging that into my Photoshop file, and then I get this bounding box, which didn't happen when we drag and drop from the internet. And then I hit enter, and it places the file.
Can you go back to how you downloaded the picture?
Yeah, sure thing. If you right-click and save image as.
I'm getting it to go somewhere completely different.
That's fine. Let's see what's going on. Right-click that image. You don't have right-click enabled. So, for anybody who's having right-clicking problems, if you are right-clicking and not getting a message, these computers go back to 0 every time you reboot them. So unfortunately, at the beginning of every class, and you probably should be doing this, at the beginning of every class, go to Apple up here, System Preferences, Mouse, and change this to Secondary Button. It's maddening that that happens, but, you know.
Where's this is what?
Go to Mouse,
Okay.
and then change that to Secondary Button.
Okay.
Yeah, because so much of what we're doing involves right-clicking that it's really somewhat necessary. If you really don't want to do that, you can also hold Control while you click. Holding Control while you left-click on a Mac is the same as right-clicking, but more tedious. So. Now we see that that placed file has a special weird icon in its layer structure. We also have an opportunity here to see I now have 3 layers in, to see that we are indeed looking down through the layers. Right now, this one is the largest image, and it's right on top. If I click this eye to make it invisible, I can see that this one, the smaller of the images, is on top of my bottom final turtle. Turtle's all the way down. Make sense?
When I tried to make it bigger, it messed it up, like the pixels and everything.
We will talk about that in a moment. I'm curious to know what you're seeing, but I think that's what I'm about to address. So if it's not, keep that in mind and get me later. Karen, do you need more help?
I'm just behind.
Oh, well, let's get caught up.
Still not. There's
So
no download.
you clicked in the gray space, I believe. So right click on the picture. There you go. Save image as.
Oh,
Then it's going to save and download. It's going to call it images.
okay. Just say
Yeah, just save. And I'll bet that you have the same, like that image says it's huge, but I'll bet it's actually a thumbnail.
it's very tiny. When I dragged it, it was.
Yeah.
So
it's
then
just
I can drag it into
Yep.
here.
from your downloads folder. So it looks like you did. Yeah, that worked. All right, so now you have the bounding box, which is where you
Just
speak.
hit enter.
Hit enter, place it. So, I don't know why it imports photos in two different ways, depending on what source you grabbed it from. But when you import it straight from your computer, it places the file as a smart object.
I'm good.
Pardon?
Yeah, I didn't save it right first time, I think.
Cool. So when you drag an image in from your local computer, it saves as a smart object. It places it as a smart object. When you take it from the internet, it seems to, this version, just be importing it straight as pixels. So, you can tell what a smart object is by this little thumbnail here. This little extra icon on the layer. You'll see that the other two images that we got from the internet do not have that. And what a smart object does is it always refers to this, it protects that file. In most things we do in Photoshop, you can work destructively or non-destructively. And that's a really important thing to kind of wrap your brain around. If you are working destructively, you are changing the pixels that are there. You can think of it like digitally painting. You are changing the colors or the transparency of the pixels that exist in this little digital painting we have. If you are working non-destructively, you can always go back to the original image that you brought in. It's always referencing that source image. The Photoshop will always remember this turtle exactly the way that it was, whatever I do to it, until I turn it from a smart object into pixels. Does that make sense? All right, so one quick demonstration of that. Everyone should just kind of watch the screen instead of try to follow me on this. But I'm going to take this medium-sized turtle that I downloaded. I'm going to press Command-T to get a free transform box. Free transform lets me spin it with the mouse. It lets me make it bigger. And it lets me, if I hold another button, oh Lord, Command-C, Command-Dupe. Command-C, there we go. Free transform, if I hold, I think it's Command, yep, then I can distort it, which lets me like fake 3D planes and perspectives and stuff. So that's the free transform tool. While holding Command and grabbing a corner.
Control-T.
Yep, Command-T, I'm sorry, forgive me. Command-T is free transform. You can also get to it from Edit, free transform. That's not quite what I want to do right now. You're going to be using it most often for rotation and scale. So right now, I'm going to do scale. So I'm going to take this image, I'm going to Command-T it, I'm going to make it really super small. And then I'm going to hit Enter to secure that transformation. And then I'm going to hold Command-T again and make it really big. I did this wrong. I'm going to go back a few steps. Give me a second. We're going to go right back here. I'm just going to duplicate this layer so that I don't lose it. And then I'm going to turn it off. And I did that by holding Alt and dragging and dropping it. Holding Alt, dragging and dropping creates a new instance, which is pretty much the same as in Illustrator. I think we probably should all know that in Illustrator too by now. So now I have just a hidden copy here. I'm then going to do the same thing I did just before. Command-T, make it really small. And I'm going to hit enter. And then I'm going to hit Command T again. And now I'm going to make it really big. We can see immediately that these are the only pixels that it has left. It has made it really small, so it had to throw out a whole bunch of pixels, and these are the only pixels left in that image. And when I hit enter, it's going to it's going to alias and dither those pixels to try to make an image at this many pixels, which must be like 3000 by 3300. I'm going to hit enter. And so it kind of brought back our turtle, but not very well. Very pixelated image. Make sense? Everyone with me? Cool. So I'm going to hide that. I'm going to look at my original. I'm going to right-click it and convert it to a smart object. We'll see that now it has that little fancy icon. And now this image, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to make it really small. Enter. Command T. Then I'm going to make it really big. Enter. Turtle came back. Now it's important to note that I did not make the turtle quite as big as this. I'm now going to make the turtle about that size. Command T. And I'm going to scale it a slightly different way. I'm going to put it in the middle of this turtle. And then I'm going to grab, up here we can see width and height. It is already 110% of its original size. I'm going to click this lock, so it locks the width to the height. If I didn't do that, it would squish or stretch it. But put this in the middle, lock the width and the height. Now when I click on the H or W and drag left or right with those little arrows, it goes up or down. So I'm just making it the same size. Hitting enter. That still looks like a pretty darn good turtle. Certainly better than the other one, because it's always referencing those original pixels. It's secured and locked those as a protected set of pixels and thrown it off in a corner closet for Photoshop to always reference. Make sense?
How would you copy that layer?
The way I copy the layer, and this is something that's a little tricky, but I'd recommend playing with it until you get it right. Pardon?
Well, you can just right-click on the layer, then it says duplicate layer.
You certainly can do that. What I do, so if you right-click, duplicate layer right there, that is certainly one way. What I do is I hold Alt Option, and I click and drag the layer up or down. Now I was just getting a clipping mask option, so it's important to make sure you don't make it a clipping mask. And now I can't seem to replicate that on purpose. I have no idea how I got that clipping mask, but that's fine. If you see a little arrow with a downward box while you're doing that Alt drag trick, that arrow with the downward mask is making it a clipping mask, not duplicating it. So just watch out for that icon when you're Alt dragging. Really funny that I can't get it to do that again. Wonder what I was pressing. Anyway, I'll look that up and try to fix it for next class. So I'm going to Command T again. This smart object remembers its original scale, so it's now 219% of the original image. I'm going to put it back to 100. Oh, and I didn't lock it, so I need to type it in both times. Enter. So this is the image as I brought it in. This is the original number of pixels in this image. You generally, especially for something you're going to print and frame, should never make an image scale up over 100%. If you're over 100%, even if you can't see it on this screen I'm only zoomed in at 12%. Let's just do a little test and see if we can see it at 100%. So I'm going to Command T this image. I'm going to make it back to 200. I'm going to lock it. 220, back to where it was. I'm going to change my zoom of my document. I'm going to hit Enter to secure it. Boop. I'm going to change my document zoom down here in the bottom left to 100. And we can see that it is not a very sharp image anymore. We are now looking really close on the image here, and that's what we're going to see if we print it. We're going to see a blurred, fuzzy, pixelated image. It's not too pixelated, it just looks out of focus rather than like a bunch of blocks. But that same artifact is something we always want to avoid. We get that by making an image more than 100%. When we scale an image up beyond its original size, Photoshop needs to invent those pixels. And it makes the best guess, and it's always getting better, but it's not perfect and it looks fuzzy. So, when you are harvesting your materials today during lab play, generally speaking, you want to make everything a smart object. Make sure that everything is a smart object before you start playing with it. And then make sure that it's never over 100% scale. Make sense? If you need a bigger image, you need to find more pixels, not scale it up beyond its original pixel set. We're going to be working with newspaper scans. When you scan a newspaper, you can scan it at 72 dots per inch, or 300 dots per inch, or 10 million dots per inch. And so if you want a D on the newspaper to be the size of this 11 by 18 paper, you need to scan it at a bazillion pixels per inch, so that when you load it into your document and print it at 300 dots per inch, it's much larger. Does that make sense to everyone? Great. So. Those are smart objects. Let's go back down to 100 here. Command T. 100. Oh, and I messed it up again. 100. Cool. So. We're going to talk a little bit about selection tools now. And masks. I'm going to demonstrate the wrong way to do it first, so that we can see why the right way is special. Because the right way is more complicated. If we ever need something not to be a smart object, we can right-click it and click Rasterize Layer. That changes it from a protected file into a bunch of pixels. There are some things you can't do to a smart object. I'm going to undo that and kind of demonstrate. If I wanted to paint on this, if I wanted to grab a brush here, grab this, and then here I'm painting, let's paint red, and I'm trying to paint onto my smart object. It tells me I can't. It's a smart object. It's a protected file. I can't change the color of those pixels. So my options are either to make a new layer over it and paint on that, or I can right-click, rasterize, and then now I can paint on it. Now those pixels of this image are forever red. I can undo it, but I can't make them disappear like I could when it was on a different layer. Make sense? So, if you ever try to do something to a smart object, like if I click this and try to paint on it, it'll tell me it can't do that. It's a smart object. Probably you should listen to it and do whatever you're trying to do on a new layer. That's the magic of smart objects and non-destructive editing. And that's helping you work non-destructively. But, pardon? I right-clicked it, and I convert to smart object. So, I'm going to work with this as not a smart object first. What I want to do is I want to delete this green space. I want to just cut this out. But it won't let me, because that object is not directly editable. It's a smart object. So I'm going to convert it to, I'm going to rasterize it. And then I'm going to delete it. I have now erased those pixels. To get this transparency grid, I just made my white background invisible. So, if everything is invisible, you're looking at nothing. This grid, if we haven't seen it yet, how do we all know this grid? Is this grid new to anyone? All right, cool. Well, it means transparency. It means nothing's there. So, I've rasterized this layer, selected an area, and deleted it. These pixels are gone until I hit undo. There is this really, back in the day, we only had the magic wand tool, which selected things by color, and works pretty well, you can see it. And you have a tolerance here. If I made it 100, it would probably select everything in the image, almost everything in the image. The tolerance here is where its threshold for similarity is between connected pixels. And you can see it does kind of work, but it's a little hard to clean up, and it grabs stuff that you don't necessarily want. New-ish, I mean, it's been a few years, but is this quick selection tool. So I'm clicking and holding to get these extra tools. The quick selection tool is 9 times out of 10 the tool you want to be using as your scissors. It finds the edges of things. And so when we click and drag, we can see it automatically selected all of this. Cut off his head though. We can see that there's a little plus sign in the middle of that circle. If we hold Alt, that changes to a minus sign. So I've added all of this to the selection. Now I'm holding Alt to minus this from the selection. I'm just kind of going around trying to get the edge as best I can. Oh, went too far. So now I need to, I'm gonna just undo that because that went weird. Holding Alt minus to drag and drop this. And the tool is kind of smart. It learns based on our selections as we go back and forth what information I'm trying to capture and what information I'm trying to exclude. It's really quite an impressive thing. It may think that the green here is part of the turtle. It does seem to keep thinking that the green there is part of my turtle. I'm gonna zoom in and try to work just on the head closer. And D.
Leg, the back leg.
Yeah. Right now I'm just focusing on the head, trying to...
Can I intrude for a second?
Yeah, please.
Do you mind? Don't be afraid to change the size of the selection tool because I've been through like a lot of problems because I use the selection tool a lot as a religion for doing outlines. So usually I just put like second to the smallest because if you want to get like the image like exactly how you want it, because you have to zoom in, and sometimes when you have like a bigger brush, when you zoom in, it cuts over the image.
That is very good advice.
Like
And
that, yeah.
so you can do that. This is all a brush tool. This kind of layout is the same as brushes, and you'll be seeing this layout over and over in Photoshop. So it's up here where it says 30. That's the pixel size of your brush. You can make it really big. That's too big. Or you can make it really small, and now do pixel perfect stuff. For the quick selection tool, I find you don't often need the quick selection tool only, because it's a tool to find edges. It's a broad stroke tool. Having a really small selection size is sometimes really frustrating. Sometimes you need it, but it's pretty rare for me. I generally just go for a tool that's small enough that I can do things like the eyes or the nose, and then big enough that I can still see it. But yes, you definitely don't want to be afraid of changing the size of the brush regularly. That is excellent advice. So, I've now gotten the head a bit more. I'm going to focus down here, taking this leg out of the selection. And then I want to add all this ground here. We can see that my selection tool is a little fat to get into these nails. So this would be a good situation to have a smaller one. But I'm not going to worry about that. Oop, I minus when I should have plussed. I'm just trying to kind of broad stroke it at the moment. Doop, 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 doop. Minus the belly, minus this leg. I thought this would be a really easy one, but because all the colors are so similar, I think it's having a really hard time. Which is a really excellent example of how computers see images and how people see images. It's really funny. I really thought this would be a much easier image than it's proving to be. Cool. So now I have all the area around the thing selected and all the area inside the thing not selected. I am also going to duplicate this real quick just so I have it for later. Still have all the little marching ants. That image is selected. I'm going to hit delete. I'm going to go to the correct layer and hit delete. And there, boom, I've deleted those pixels. They don't exist anymore. I have destructively edited and selected this picture of a turtle. I'm going to hit Command D to deselect, to turn off those marching ants. That's Command D. It's also up here in Select, Deselect. So, and we can see that I have this weird line here. It did not grab the last line of pixels, and that is a common rookie error. You can tell novice Photoshop people because they have a lot of mask lines around everything. They just weren't careful. They didn't see where the layers were happening. If I wanted to do this right, I would right now take my eraser tool, dupe, and then I right-clicked. Sometimes it didn't work in the quick select tool, but most of the times when you're using a brush for a brush, eraser, selection tool, anything, you can right-click somewhere and it'll bring up the tool size. So I'm going to make it pretty big. I'm just going to erase those pixels. I could have selected those pixels and hit delete. It would have done the same thing. So now I have this selection of a turtle. I've destructively edited that turtle. I'm going to show you how to non-destructively edit that turtle, which is much more complicated, but the better way of doing things. So, if you hold Command and then click on the picture icon of any layer, hold Command, click the picture icon, it will select all of the contents of that layer. So I'm going to undo, just for a purpose of demonstration, I'm going to undo deleting these random stray mask line pixels. To go back more than one step in Photoshop, you need to hold Command-Alt-Z rather than just Command-Z. Command-Z just toggles between the before and after. Command-Alt-Z goes back into your history.
For Windows, it's Control right for Command.
Yes, anytime I'm saying Command, when you go to a PC, just insert Control. Not press the insert button, but use Control. Thank you. So now I have these random pixels back, and now I'm going to hold Command and click this. And it should have selected, yep, it did select these random stray pixels too. So holding Command and clicking on the picture selects all of the pixels that are on that layer, which can be really useful when you've done things like deleted everything but the set of pixels you want. So I'm going to go to Command D. I'm going to real quick just eraser this stuff again. Cool. So I'm going to Command D. I'm going to get the selection back. You could have also gone to Select and Reselect, and that would have just brought up your last selection. So now I have that. The important thing is that I have that selection for I'm now going to make this a smart object again, convert to smart object. It is missing those pixels, but that doesn't matter for the demonstration. It might matter if this were a piece of art. So now on my smart object, I'm going to delete the last one. No, I'm not. So I have a selection on my smart object. It's the same selection I used to delete those pixels off of my dumb object, my rastered layer. I'm going to hit this little button here. This is the Add Layer Mask button. Before I use this button, the Create New Layer button, I'm going to add a layer mask. And boom, it did effectively the same thing. But we can see that the layer has this black and white business here. We saw this same black and white thing when we used clipping masks in Illustrator. In Illustrator, our masks or clipping masks are all kind of in the same area, and we could uncheck or check clipping on the transparency mask guide to make it a clipping mask or a normal mask. Here, clipping masks have a weird downward arrow and work in a feed that I find very confusing. I like working with non-clipping masks, but just masks. So this is a mask. Anywhere that this is a kind of a secondary layer that is exactly the same raster as our working document, as the layer that it's attached to. And instead of RGB pixels, it has just black or white pixels, true or false, or it's actually a grayscale, 0 to 100, or 0 to 255 actually, but it's a grayscale. you can, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. And anywhere that it's white, the pixels from the layer it's attached to are showing through. Anywhere that it's black, the pixels it's attached to are not showing through. So, just to demonstrate that pretty clearly, if I grab a black brush, and we can see that I can select the layer mask or the actual layer by clicking on the icons here. So if I have my layer mask selected, and I grab a brush, and I just paint a line down it, I'm effectively erasing those pixels.
So to link those two layers to the layer mask, we have to have just those two layers showing.
No. Gosh, I'm trying to wrap my brain around that question. I know the answer is no, but I'm having a trouble figuring out what you're doing that makes you ask that.
I think it did the mask the first layer copy.
Cool. So I'm just going to make a bunch of layers visible. I'm going to delete this layer mask, and I'm going to bring the selection back up. I reselect. There, I have that. So now I have a bunch of things. If I have this layer selected, it's going to apply the layer mask to that layer. So I need to make sure that I have the correct layer selected in my stack here
And then,
before I hit that button.
okay, that's what it was.
So right now I just have that layer only visible because it's what I want to see. I really like always having to select my layer to make sure that I'm working on the right layer. If you go up here to your select tool, you'll see that auto select is probably checked. I like unchecking that button. I'm just going to demonstrate what that does by bringing up more layers. So what this auto select does is it lets me not worry about what's selected. I can grab whatever I click on and it will move it. And I can move this background image. And it's just always auto selecting the layer that I'm working on based on what Photoshop thinks I'm trying to do. I don't like Photoshop thinking for me. It lets things like layer masks get really confusing. So I uncheck that button, and then now I can only move the layer that's selected down here. I can only make any effects or adjustments on the layer that's selected down here. If I want to move this turtle here, I need to select that turtle. I need to figure out which turtle that is in my layer stack, and then select it in my layer stack before I can move it. That's how I like to work. If you are going to choose auto select and leave that on, be careful. It will auto select your layers, and you may be working on a layer you don't think you're working on. Make sense? Cool. So I'm going to finish talking about masks, and then I'm going to pause for questions and catch up. So this layer mask, if I grab my brush and I have the layer mask selected, and I scrub over that turtle a bit, then we can kind of see, it's hard to see, and I don't want to take the time at the moment to try to find a way to magnify it, but there's a black line right here. You can see where I painted black on this little icon. If I right-click and disable temporarily disables it and puts a little red X showing that this mask is not being used right now, we can see that I have deleted no pixels. That brush, that erasure, there's no black paint here, and there's no erasure here. Because it's a smart object, that's a protected object off in the cupboard, and it has a layer mask doing the same thing instead of deleting those pixels. That make sense? So that is non-destructively selecting and editing it. The really cool thing about that is that I'm going to undo a couple steps. Cool.
How did you get your layer mask black?
I will answer that question in a moment. I want to show a few more things about layer masks, and then I'll help everyone catch up. But I think I know what you did. So I have a black, whatever's white is showing through, whatever's black is not. And just to kind of hint towards your question, if you select the layer mask and press Command-I inverts anything. Command-I, if I do that to my smart object, we'll see that I get the negative. It inverts it, Command-I. So if I invert a black and white image, all white goes to black, all black goes to white. So I effectively get exactly the opposite of my selection. So if you are ever in a situation where you've made your really elegant, well-crafted selection, and it's done exactly the opposite of the mask you wanted, super easy to just click the mask and invert it. So I'm now going to paint gray onto my mask using a big old brush. That was a very dark gray, but we can see that it's not quite deleting it. It's 50% opacity. Command Z, Command Z. Let's actually try to get, yeah, that is just about 50%, but I'm going to go a little less, a little darker, so that it's still mostly black. That's really funny that I can't. Maybe if I made it white, we'd be able to see it better. Yeah, a little bit. So we can see that gray on the mask doesn't totally delete it. It just makes it less opaque. Are we all solid on what opaque means? All right. Any questions about opacity or transparency? Great. If you wanted to do the entire layer, the opacity for the layer is right here. So we could just drag down the opacity of any given layer. But if you want to selectively reduce your opacity, you can do that on the mask. So I'm going to Command C a bunch. Oh, there we go. So what's really cool about working non-destructively is my selection really sucked right here. I totally cut off his neck. Yeah. If I had deleted those pixels, that neck is never coming back. But here, I can just paint white onto it. I can grab white, I can make sure I'm on my layer mask, and I can go in here, and even though the algorithmic selection tool didn't work for this photo, I can hand paint it by just taking my time. And I can just paint that area back in. And it's still there. And we can see that I painted too far. So now I can hit this and swap my color back to black and just paint in. And if I had a smaller brush, I'd be able to really finely craft that until when I zoomed out, you would never know that it was there. And you can do that by hand. That's still really hard to do with a mouse. I think we have some tablets lying around. Anybody have eyes on one?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So if everyone would look at Grace back here, this tablet with a pen attached to it, we have those lying around. I think they might be in a drawer somewhere. That is how you do that by hand in a way that is much more natural and familiar than with the mouse. With the algorithmic tools are much easier with a mouse than with that for me. And I use the algorithmic tools 9 times out of 10 because I'm really lousy with my hands. But when you need to go in and really fine-tune something like that, those tablets are like manna from heaven.
Yes, it is.
So. That is our opacity masks. And if you didn't have a selection, so I'm going to delete this layer mask. If you didn't have a selection at all and press this button, boop, it just puts a white mask on it. And you can then go in and make any adjustments you want to the mask. And then have it still be there. Make sense? Cool. We can see that my invert a couple times left some detritus as a smart filter. Smart filters are the same as filters, except they're non-destructive. That's really it. Some of the filters, if you go up here to filters, you'll see a whole bunch of effects you can use. Some of the filters, I'm not even going to go through that. That's not important to what we're doing today, but if you want to play with it, today's about play. Some filters can work on smart objects. Some filters need to change the pixels of the actual thing. So smart filters are filters that can work on smart objects. Blur is a pretty important one. Gaussian blur is the only one I'm really going to mention. Gaussian blur is how you, and I'm going to, preview is selected, so why? Oh, I think I have the mask selected rather than my image, and that's why we aren't seeing anything. So I'm going to make sure my image is selected. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and blur blurs an image. There are lots of different blurs: fast blur, Gaussian blur, regular blur. They're all just different algorithms of how it's blurring the pixels next to each other. John Gauss invented an algorithm that is now used for the Gaussian blur he was like 100 years ago before digital editing was ever a thing, but his algorithm for how to deal with data is the algorithm used for this blur, so it's called a Gaussian blur. Make sense? Cool. Great. And if I had secured that, we would have seen it as a smart filter. Blur, Gaussian blur, boop, boop, okay. Yeah, Gaussian blur, smart filter. And as we can see, doing digital processes to smart objects takes a long time. And I did a really strong blur, so it just really blurred it out to a giant smudge. All right, I'm going to undo that. But we saw it down here in the stack. Any questions about anything we've covered so far today?
I'm having trouble getting to cut it out.
Cool. Everyone take a few moments to just play around, try to come up with questions, and I'll come around and try to solve problems.
It was not to select the layers or anything.
Cool. So you have a selection. Great. And it is here. And you're pressing this button. So, open that, and we made a selection. And what I would really recommend you do, just grab that mouse. That'll make your life so much easier than my trackpad. I don't mean to tell you what to do or nothing, but I just wanted to invite you to. So that was just making me crazy. If I'm helping, I want to do that. So. And what I thought was happening was that you had left one layer above it visible. That was like, but now, did that answer your question? Cool. So now you've selected that map. I'm going to undo it just so you have the muscle memory. So now add a mask. Boom. Now you want to invert that mask. So Control I is invert, and that works because that mask was selected. If you had this selected, like if you saw the bounding box around there, oh, you have a touch screen. That's really exciting. Then you would have inverted the colors of the turtle, but instead you inverted the colors of the mask, which gives you the result you want. Makes sense? So the brush tool is no, that's a selection. Where maybe in the pencil. Yeah, brush tool. Cool. So and then this is black and white. So like if this weren't black and white, you could click that little thing above it to just make primary, secondary, black, white. And then this little arrow thing flips them. So you can, and I think X is the shortcut for that. So you can easily go back and forth between black and white. And then now you need to select your, cancel this because you don't need to pick a different color you want. So select the mask you want to edit. And select the mask for it. And then now you're about to paint white onto that mask, which means you're about to reveal data. If you wanted to hide data, it would be black under that mask. So to get rid of this line, you would grab your brush and
first
black there.
pull it into our
If you right click
document
anywhere,
before
you
we
can easily
convert
change
it
the
to
size.
smart image?
Yeah, and he said if you download it first, it will automatically turn it into like a smart image. But if it's a high enough, and those, those are really low.
Oh, you're
Yeah, I just remember it feels
small.
like
Or 300 by 300, it's really small.
You're using a real small brush right now. It will kind of
So
I'm
that'll
so
be
lost.
So
Oh, you're
if it's
doing
not
great.
at least 1,000 by 1,000.
You are not working with masks though.
So choose something else.
Yeah, so I choose something at least,
Yeah,
you
you
know,
kind of
1,000.
have, I'm kind of curious how you got this. When you are, so, do you mind if I try for a second?
But it's easy enough to convert it to a smart image once you get it in there. So if you can just,
These are not, I don't know
if
how
you just
you've done this.
click and drag, then you can easily
So
convert it
this
to smart
is your
image
original,
once you get it
these
into.
together are your original photographs.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to bring those down, and I'm going to hide all these so we don't see them. Do you have your original wolf anywhere? No, it's fine. So I'm going to right-click these and re-merge them. So I'm gonna. You don't have right-click enabled, so we have to at the moment do control. So I'm going to control-click and merge layers. Cool. So now we're back. These are invisible, and we're kind of back to the original. Not quite, because we still have this 1 pixel line, but it's fine. So just real quick, I'm going to create a selection. I'm not going to worry about making it perfect, but here is your selection stuff. Everything about this layout is a little funny. Not sure what's happening here. Oh, here's your quick selection tool. So, just going to real quick grab a big chunk, grab a big chunk. Cool, so we mostly have a selection here. Marching ants, I like that. So I think I don't know how you did it. I think you deleted and then went to the other one and deleted. But if instead you grab this guy here, this is the Add Layer Mask button. So go ahead and click that. Yep. Cool. So that's done. Look, this is a layer mask. This has done the exact opposite of what you want. So now if you click this, make sure it has that white box around it, which it does, and then press Command-I. That inverted this. If you would press Command-I here, it would have inverted the colors of your wolf. Like if you had selected there and then Command-I, that inverts the colors of your wolf. But because you're inverting your mask here, that changes black to white and changes what's revealed. And so this is how you should work.
Okay.
Makes sense? And you should always, before you do that, I would recommend right-click. Again, you can't right-click, so you need control-click. Do you want me to put on right-click? So you go up here to the apple, and then System Preferences, and then Mouse, and then change this to secondary button, and then Accept. There. So now you have right-click enabled. And so if you right-click this,
Which one?
it's on the letters there. And then convert to smart object. Now, that is, what you want to do is see that symbol. Whenever you import a new picture, you want to make it a smart object so that it never deletes it. Because here, you just erase those pixels and can never get them back. On a smart object, you can always get them. Does that make sense? Cool. So go ahead and keep playing. Try to do that for a few more pictures. Coming right over to Matt. Somebody back ready to help to Cameron and Raphael next? Excellent. Be right over.
It's like it wasn't letting me change select different layer or anything, and when I tried
Cool.
to right click it just
So that's because you have imported, you placed an object. And so, oh my gosh, it gives me no control. It's totally taken control away from me. What's going on? Your bounding box is here. That needs to be placed. So you need to hit enter right now before you can do anything else in the program. Enter.
yeah, weird turn.
Very good. And so now that has been placed, now you can do things again.
Yeah, and you already used the selection tool. I wasn't able to follow with everything you were showing me.
That's fine.
Missing stuff.
That's why we're doing this. One more down. And then that's
this
your
one, right?
one more up. There you go. That's your quick selection tool, and that's what finds edges of things.
Didn't you make this bigger or something?
I was, in fact, explicitly cautioning that you don't make things over 100% their size.
Right.
So you're good to play, and then holding Alt is what changes that from adding to minusing.
I'm so lost.
It looks to me like you're doing great, so I'll be back to you after Raphael. After Raphael was second, first, what can I do for you? Cool. Cool. First, just for cleanliness, let's right-click here and delete smart filters. Delete filters. Cool. Oh Lord, really? Right-click. Clear smart filters. Cool. Great. So I don't know, those look like history that we don't. Right now you've got marching ants that are nowhere near the marching ants that you want. So you need to delete them. Cool. So now grab your selection. And go ahead and try to find the edges. You can either start inside the shark and try to select the shark, or you can start outside the shark and select the layer. And just be bold right now. Don't worry about it. You're just letting do this thing. Cool. Great. We have most of the shark. And we can undo everything we're about to do, and you can go back and do it. So now we have a shark. Now we need to make a selection of shark. Go ahead and add the layer. You have a smart object, which is great. This is the juncture where you want to make sure that it's a smart object. It is. That's fantastic. Now add a layer mask to it. That button, right? One to it. There you go. Ooh, you've added a layer. Did you understand everything I said about layer mask, or do you have more questions? Cool. The important thing to remember is white lets you see data. Black makes data go away. So now, if you painted white here, it would reveal that part. If you painted black there, it would hide that part. And it's important to make sure you know which one of these things you have selected. So yeah, you can, if you had selected Command I is invert. So if you had selected the water, this is what we would have done. But then you can change that to the shark by selecting your mask and pressing Command I. If this were selected, Command I would just invert the colors of the shark. Does that make sense? And I'm going to clear these smart filters because apparently also it adds a bunch of smart filters. Make sense? Any other questions right now? Paint black there would get rid, like if you painted black there, it would delete those pixels. It would be like using an eraser. Black hides black reveals. Something else you can do. So like here we really messed up. Painting there might look more hand-drawn next to this hard edge. So we can temporarily disable the layer mask and then go back, try to get a better selection, and then like fail with that. But you can, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you can do different things. And like let's say, yeah, it doesn't matter. I want you to play with that before we go to the next step. So I'm enabling layer mask. Go back to here. Sound good?
Yes.
Cool.
Oh, no, I fixed it.
Cool. You good?
Is there anything else that we need to do for this? Anything like specific lines?
I just want you to successfully do it to a couple images. So yeah, you're doing great.
Is this
We're gonna be doing more in a minute, but right now I want to get everyone to this level.
Yeah.
So how do I trace this without using this?
That's gonna take me an extra second. I want to make sure that Karen's straight because I promised to go over. I'm gonna be right over and we're gonna figure that out. I will tell you. You hint. You unlock the background and invert it. If you can't figure out how to do that, I'll be over there in a second.
My selection. Sorry.
Sorry, let me help Karen first, and then I'll be.
So I had two pictures on top of one another,
Mhm.
and I selected this, and then this is what was left. So now I'm trying to just select people, which I think I've got.
Cool.
But
So
now how do I
you-
do the mask thing, right?
You are a couple steps strange. For starters, you have two masks on here already. You have a vector mask and a layer mask, and that's not what you want. If ever you see two there,
Uh-huh,
you've done something beyond what we're doing right now, and we
Okay.
need to go back. So let's just delete those. Right-click each of them and delete them.
Push command and control.
Delete vector mask, and then right-click, delete layer mask. Cool. So now we're back to 0.
uh-huh.
Make this invisible for a minute. Cool. So you did not make that a reveal it again. This one has a smart object. This one is not a smart object. So you've already deleted a lot of those pixels. Let's go ahead and make it a smart object so we can
Want me to do it?
stop destroying it. So
Okay,
right click it,
Yeah.
and then I've never figured out what exactly it worked. We didn't right click it the right way. Right click where it says images. Cool. Convert to smart object. There's a contextual menu where like it opens up a secondary menu, and I've never really figured out where I'm clicking to make that happen. But I can figure it out. So now it's a smart object. Now we won't accidentally delete any pixels. We still have your selection there. So now we can add a layer mask here. There you go.
okay, cool.
Makes sense?
Yeah, and then I just go in and erase the lines.
You would paint black on the lines. Painting black hides data, and on the layer mask. Painting black hides data. Painting white reveals data. All right. Marisha was next, and then I'll be back for you. Did you figure out your background? All right. So. You want to do what?
Didn't you, first?
Do I use the paintbrush to paint?
Yeah. So I grab your image, click and hold here. That's your magic wand tool right now. Click and hold the selection tool, and then draw a selection around it.
Just this.
Yeah, you can either draw inside the turtle to get the edges, or you can draw outside the turtle to get everything but the turtle. Both are fine, and sometimes it's easier one way or another for different pictures. Right now, just do it quick and dirty. Yeah, great, that's doing great. That was weird. Yeah, do it again. So what's happening is that we are working on the white background that's hidden right now. We do not have our layer selected. That's why I can't do anything. Alright, so go ahead and what you just did was drawing on the edge. You want to draw on either side of the edge. Cool, so it's automatically selecting everything. It's having a hard time. So do you mind if I just want to test it? So first, when I had everything, I'm just going to Command D, and then I'm going to start on the inside because it was not doing it so well. Right, yeah, and that seems to be working. So Command D, try drawing on the inside of the turtle. And again, don't go too close to the edges, just especially because your goal is to learn how to do that. Cool. Great. So now we have a selection, right? So now if we click this add a layer mask, one more over, there you go. That added that selection to here. Now anywhere we paint black on this, it will hide data. Anywhere we paint white on that, it will reveal data. So what you were asking about this, I'm gonna plug this in for starters. There you go. And now this should work. No. It does not. It does kinda. So I don't know how to make that work. And it's beyond the realm of this particular class. So, but what you would do is, if you could do that, you would go up here to your brush tool, which is hidden behind your pencil tool right now. So brush tool. I'm gonna I should just be telling you how to do this. I'm gonna put this back to the pencil tool. Grab your brush tool. Right click somewhere. Did you enable right click when we did it as a class? Yeah. Yeah, cool, you did. Cool. So now make your size bigger just so you can see the brush. I would drag this rather because these will do different things. Great, that's fine. Cool. And then right click outside of it. Or left click outside of it. Oh, and we accidentally left a dot, so Command Z. So, first thing, hit that black white button to change your colors to black and white. Yep. And then now if we want to switch black and white easily, we can hit that button there. One up. Yep. And cancel this. And then go back and hit that swap button. So see how that switches which one you're working with? So right now we're working with blacks. We'll hit one more time to work with white. And then now we have this selected, our white boxes around there. So anywhere we paint will reveal data. So try to paint out ahead of it. There you go. Makes sense. Cool, because you're painting white onto this, which is revealing the image beneath it. Cool, you good? Awesome. Matthew was next. Anyone else?
Me,
Sure.
I forgot how annoying this selection tool can be. When I try to start doing it, it just does that all night.
Yep. Then we gotta figure out something to do. Make a smaller mask and paint on it. as soon as we're ready, I'm going to show more selection tools.
Lazy,
And to cut things out. So I will, that turtle, like, I would try to do it on this turtle instead of that turtle, because that turtle was problematic. Cool. Cool. And, what can I do for you? Cool. Because you have an active selection. So that's something I should demonstrate to the class. But right now you see marching ants.
Right.
When you see marching ants, you can only work inside the marching ants. So hit Control D to let you work on the whole image. Cool.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, now it should work. Is it? Oh, you still have marching ants. Oh,
Okay, don't click on the
I know. Control D. You have not the brush tool, but the quick selection tool. That's why you're creating marching ants every time you click. So now anything black. And then now, you are painting black. No, you are working on the mask. Make the layer above it invisible. Oh, that's why.
Okay.
Because,
Oh, okay.
yeah, it's because that object we were trying to erase was actually on this layer.
Oh, okay.
Makes sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Really make sure you're working on the right layer.
Layers.
And when you have like 100 layers, you sometimes just gotta go through the lines and click each one and figure out what data's on what layer.
True.
It didn't work on that one either.
What's that?
It did not do it right on that one either.
For this image, it worked well for me working on the inside of the turtle. So Command D right now to get rid of the selection. Alright, that's fine. And then work on the inside of the turtle, just in the middle. Draw straight, yeah, cool. And don't go too, yep, there you go. Doing great. And then go and grab, just like draw a line down the middle of the head. Yep, cool. So there, what happened is you went into the water, which made it think that you were selecting blue. So now you need to get rid of all this. So hold Alt and draw like a line like that, and make sure. Nope. Stop. Command Z.
It was Z. You said Z, right?
Yeah. Let's go to Command D for a minute. So now we're back to 0. Draw a straight line from his eye to about here. Cool. Great. Now, look. Now draw a line from here to the middle.
Here?
Like in the middle of this fin to connect it to that. Great. So you are going to have to go in and get that a bit better, but don't do it right now. Now draw one here, but be careful not to go into any of the blue. Cool. Great. So what we're doing is we're adding to the selection mask. Now, click here in the blue. Just click it. Cool. And so, oh no, I've accidentally slipped into the blue. I've added all of this to the selection. I don't want that. So hold Alt to subtract from the selection. And then click in the blue again. And click and drag. Not going anywhere near the turtle, click and drag through the blue a bit. Cool. See how it's reduced your selection there? You still have a bit here, so Alt drag there. Down here, this is your selection here. You're trying to get rid of these marching ants, so this is your selection. You gotta drag, hold Alt and drag through this area. Cool. Yeah, you get rid of those marching ants. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So and then right now, if you go ahead just for demonstration, click that layer mask. It's one to the left. That's your layer mask. So this is your black-white image that is showing and revealing that.
Then what do you need to make this stuff here again? Like showing?
If you paint white onto anything, it reveals it. If you paint black onto anything, it hides it. So what I would do is, what I would actually do is I would undo a step and go back and keep working on your selection. But if you make a mask and it's imperfect, that's how you fix it. Make sense? Cool. I would like to demonstrate a few more things to the class, which I hope everyone at least successfully created a mask. Doop doop doop. So, I'm going to I now have a bunch of random smart filters that I never meant to have. I'm going to right-click them. I'm going to delete filter mask. I'm going to right-click them and clear smart filters. Cool. Now I'm back to 0. I'm going to right-click this mask and delete the layer mask. This guy was really hard for me to select. Had a really hard time getting the algorithmic tools to work on him. So, what can I do about that? One way to make really fine selections is with the pen tool. This is more like, so this will function also like a pair of scissors. We should be familiar by now with the pen tool from Illustrator. If you click and click, it makes a straight line. If you click and drag, it makes a curved line. Our goal here is to make a closed vector shape around the turtle. And so we need to go in pretty close, and we need to create our shape. And this is, if your algorithmic tools don't work, this is your manual pair of scissors. So I'm just going to go real fast so I'm not wasting everyone's time, but can still demonstrate. I'm just going to cut out the shell here. And then super important, when we get close, we need to connect, and we see that little circle around the pen tool? That means I'm going to close this path. So I click and drag one final time to close my path. I now have a vector shape. I can do vector shapey stuff like I could in Illustrator with this path tool, but what I want to use it is as a selection. So if we hold Command and press Enter right now, Command, Enter, it changes that from a vector path into a raster selection. So that is how I've cut my line. And now I can do all the same things with it I could with my other kinds of selections. Make sense? So if your quick selection tool is not getting the edge you want, the pen tool is probably your next best bet. It's a pain in the butt, super tedious, but that's how you really control where your scissors are going. The other things to note are in your brush tool or anything that has a brush tool. I'm just going to, I'll dupe, and then I'll go to a new layer. This is your new layer button. Anytime you want to paint on new layer stuff, it's this create new layer. So I now have a brand new layer. And I'm going to grab my brush. And I'm going to make my brush really big. And if you didn't see, you can right-click anywhere you want to make a brush. And then if you right-click, and you can't keep right-clicking because it will just keep showing up. So you left-click off of your image. If you right-click and left-click on your image, you'll leave a dot. So, right-click, I can adjust my size. I can also adjust my hardness. I'm just going to make a really big brush and then show you a hardness at each extreme. Dupe. Try and scales up so fast. There we go. Boop. That's 0 hardness. Right-click. Oh, Lord. Brush. Then boop. That's 100% hardness. Everyone intuitively understand the difference?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So any range between them, I'll just do a 50% hardness for fun. Boop. Make sense?
Yep.
So the kind of importance of that for masks are, if you want a hard edge here, you don't want a soft brush. So I'm going to paint, I'm going to right click and make my brush way smaller. That looks about right. And then, dupe. So if I have a really soft brush here, and I'm trying to get rid of this, it leaves a soft line, which actually might be what I want for this situation, to kind of blend this out. If I have a really hard brush while I'm painting this, it'll leave a very crisp and digital line, which also might be what I want if I'm trying to really get in there. Does that make sense? Everyone following? Great. So hardness, softness. Oh, and then the last thing is, all right, so on this layer, I command clicked this to select all the pixels in it. And we can see that for some reason it didn't select these gradient images. That's curious. I really thought the selection would be way out here. But that's fine. I don't need to worry about that right now. I have an active selection. I am looking at marching ants. I want to paint a big yellow smiley face on this layer. So I'm going to grab my brush. I'm going to change this to yellow. And I'm going to make it really big. Cool. And I want to paint. Why isn't it painting? I can't paint on this layer because I have an active selection. I can only work inside. Oh, weird. It did have a selection. So if you hit Q, you can see where your mask is. And yes, you can see that even though the marching ants are here, the actual selection is much farther than that. So anyway, right now, because I have an active selection, I can only work within that selection. If I command D, then I can paint my smiley face all over the layer. Make sense? Cool. So those are things to watch out for. I am going to also demonstrate so if you Google newspaper archives, whoops, that's not what I'm going to do. I got lost in myself. You should find a Wikipedia list of online newspaper archives. And these are just scanned archives. I would go to any one that says free. And I would just try, it came up so much earlier on another website. I'm going to go back a couple steps and see if I can't find one that's easier. I think the first one I clicked earlier today worked just fine. Or the Age here. Cool, so these are all scanned newspapers. And I can click one and save, get this newspaper. Every website is going to work differently, so I should have had a better plan for this live demonstration. This is not free, so I'm going to go back a couple steps. The Ambito was what I think I clicked earlier. That seemed to work just fine. Of course, now it's not available. How funny. What on earth did I do? Well, I'm going to work on that later. For the moment, I'm going to go to images and just do newspaper scans. Cool, Le Monde. That's great. I'm going to drag and drop it the same way I did before. And you can also use, this is the marquee selection tool. So for things like text, this might work. If I just wanted to use le, I could drag a rectangle around it, and then I have my marching ant selection. I can do all the same things I've been doing with selections. So this is just, if you have shapes, you've got circles and rectangles and stuff here you can do, which may be easier for some things in a newspaper. And then I can do all the same things that I have been doing. So what I want you to do for the rest of class is using only newspaper material, scanned newspaper material, that you find anyway, and I'm going to work right now to try to find you a more consistent newspaper source, and I'll post it on the module. But it can come from Google Images, any scanned newspaper source. I want you just to find images and parts of words that speak to you and construct a very abstract self-portrait. Just a collage of images and noises and phonemes that have some reverberation inside of you somewhere. I don't want you to actually create a face. I want you to be real Dadaist about it. Make sense? Cool. Go to town. I will start helping people again after I find a newspaper source.
rid of things in layers? Do you just, like, how do you get rid of layers?
I can be there in just a moment to help. But short answer, if you want to look at the screen real quick, if you want to delete a layer entirely, you select it and then hit this trash can. But I'll help you more specifically in a second.
That's fine.
All right, if I could have everyone's attention, there is now a Module 4 raster, and American Newspapers is linked in it. These are a Library of Congress newspaper section. You should be able to search for headlines. It's got everything from 1789 to 1963. And it should be historically significant newspapers. So if you click any given one, you should be able to download it as a JPEG. Save file, okay. And then this should just import here. It did not seem to. Yes, it did. There we go. And it needs to place as a smart object. And there you go. You've got a super high-res newspaper in there. And in fact, it's crazy high-res. At our high-resolution 11 by 18, this is only 13%. So 100% by 100%. This is how big we can get with the newspaper. So that should be good for you. You're free to use any source you want, but that's a good one. I recommend it. And it seems super easy to use, which is merciful. Anybody have any questions right now? Great. Be right back. And I'll stop that screen capture.